MuseScore. Welcome to the MuseScore Café. So this is my regular weekly series I do on Wednesdays where we talk about some aspect of making music using MuseScore and talk about different subjects every week. Sometimes we just take questions, lots of different stuff going on. And today is the third Wednesday of the month. So we'll be the special series I've been doing lately called Score of the Month, where I just look at a score. I either enter one myself or look at one that someone else has entered, and we talk about what's involved. So today we have a score, a transcription of a solo piano piece. I think many of you will recognize the piece. The transcription is by Peter Underwood, and so I will be looking at his piece. And Peter is here in the chat, and if it kind of works out, we'll bring him on to talk also if it works out. But the new Circle live stream thing that we used last Friday, this is what I'm going to use for whenever I need to talk to someone in the future. So the music masterclass is going to move over to that system soon. I'll be talking more about that later. So, welcome everyone, and I love it when people are checking in from where people are from, and I see people from different places here. So the piece that we're going to look at here that Peter has transcribed is a piano transcription of Christmas Time Is Here by Vince Guaraldi, and Vince Guaraldi and Lee Mendelson. Lee Mendelson wrote the lyrics, and so we're just going to be talking about how Peter is actually using MuseScore, the actual notation features here, whether he's using the program effectively, opportunities to improve things, and also just the notation, the look of things. So I'm putting on my hat as a semi-professional editor, having actually done some of that work, editing scores to that were maybe written by other people, and then I edit them for inclusion in a publication. I've done some amount of that, and I've just, through my work with MuseScore, I've learned a lot of the rules of notation that we use to implement a lot of the defaults in MuseScore. So this is what I'm going to talk about is the way the notation works here, but also things that are done to maybe tweak playback and so forth. So the first thing that I'm going to do is, so Peter, you're here on the chat. I'm going to invite you to tell us whatever you want to do, whatever you want us about the piece, but I'm going to post a link to the piece on MuseScore.com, and so people can read your comments there, if that's okay, unless that's not okay, in which case I'll delete the link, but because it looks like you have it as unlisted, but I'm going to assume that that's okay, that we're all trying to learn from this here. So so I'm going to post this link in here so people can read the comments. And basically, it's a well, Peter, maybe you can describe also in your own words, but I'm going to just look at this here. What it's saying is that this is a the piece is Christmas Time Is Here by Vince Guaraldi, and Peter has transcribed aspects from the recording but done his own modifications to this, and maybe you can clarify that a little bit. But the transcription is of your performance based on Vince Guaraldi's. That's my understanding of what's happening here. So I'm going to just play this in MuseScore, and I think people will recognize it's very reminiscent of the original from Vince Guaraldi. So let's take a listen here. Okay, so something is off already as I start this. Is it that the chord symbols are on? Let me check that. Is chord symbol playback turned on? Come on. Really? Oh, F8. Nope, the chord symbols are not on. Something I thought I heard like a surprising note, and I'm not sure what was going on, but I'll just play from here. You don't have sound, really? All right. gonna be one of those days. Screen share. Let me reselect my screen share. It says it's doing it. All right. I'm going to assume that if Peter doesn't have sound, no one else has sound. And I'm going to play a little bit of this again and see if I have sound. Yeah. So if Dennis says he has sound, Peter, I'm going to guess that now your whatever browser you're using isn't working for you there, because I know we are switching. All right, so I'm going to start over again here with the sound, and Peter, if you just work it out at your end, that's fine. But yeah, I'm just going to hear what we hear, and then go from there. All right, and it's going to be one of those days also as far as the stuttering. I now know what I'm hearing sound-wise, and that's going to be one of the first things that I want to talk about. It's the pedal. The pedal is sustaining notes from previous chords. That's not doing us favors here. So we're going to fix the pedal coming up. But I want to see if I get any better results now. So I'll start here at the melody. Okay, so between the stuttering in the audio, which, okay, is going to be one of those, between that, but also the pedal, I feel like I want to remove that pedal, and that might be part of the problem also. It could be that MuseScore's actually getting overwhelmed. So I'm just going to delete this pedal marking. So the deal is, this notation here has the pedal just sustaining throughout the entire piece. And what it means is I can still hear the A natural now. I'm still hearing the A natural. And then now I'm still hearing the A flat in this measure. So I'm hearing notes held over from the previous chord into the next chord. And it's very dissonant and very distracting. And I think it's also giving MuseScore fits in the playback. So I'm just going to delete that pedal marking because we're going to need to re-add it a measure at a time. And I'll show how to do that. So I'll again start with the melody and then see if we're better shape now, hopefully. All right, nice job, Peter. I like the things that you've done with the arrangement there musically, and yeah, that's really good. And there's just the notation is what we'll be talking about here today. So yeah, Peter, the YouTube is always on a few second delay, so that's why you weren't hearing sound. All right, so in removing the pedal, you saw that cleaned up the performance, right? So the deal is that's just a fact of life. It's an unfortunate fact of life, but the internal synthesizer thinks that those notes are still playing, and it's trying desperately to juggle all, because it can only play a certain number of notes at once, and it's trying to juggle which notes to keep playing and which notes have to get kicked out because now you've overwhelmed it. You've got more notes playing at once because the notes from the first measure are technically still sustaining. So it overwhelms the synthesizer. It's not a great implementation that happens, and hopefully in MuseScore 4, new synthesizer, that's gone. So that issue is MuseScore's fault. But the fact that the chords bleed into each other is something we want to deal with. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to fix this. I'm going to bring in the palette here, and what I'm going to do is, well, I'm going to show you what sort of to do and what not to do. I'm going to start by adding this pedal marking. But if I select the measure and then add the pedal marking, and this is the version I'm adding, the kind that starts with a vertical line, ends with an angled bracket, because the idea is these angled brackets are supposed to kind of meet. But you'll notice it's not meeting. It's like I want this angle bracket to actually end up under this note. So the thing is, I don't actually want the angle bracket to end at that measure. I want it to actually extend into the next measure. So I just selected it and hit Shift right. And now what I can do is one measure at a time, continue applying this version here, the version with angle brackets on both sides. And this is really how you do it. And if I did this thing often enough, I would figure out exactly the right. I think that was it right there. So let me think about this. I have what I wanted to do after applying that, I want to figure out the exact key sequence that's going to just keep selecting one measure plus one note, because that's what I'm always going to want, a measure plus a note. And then I want to reapply that same pedal marking. So there is a shortcut in Edit Preferences Shortcuts that's called Apply Current Palette Element, and I've customized that to be \. It's not anything by default, but it's a cool little thing. So right now, the last thing I applied was that pedal. So if I press \, it applies it again. And now all I have to do is keep selecting measure plus note, apply, select measure plus note, apply. And what I discovered is if I hit the right arrow, no, that didn't actually do it this time. So I'm just finding, I guess it has to do with what was previously selected. So control right, and then shift control right. Okay, that seems like it did it. Now, is that going to happen again? Control right, shift control right. Nope, that left off this one. So anyhow, I'm actually trying to discover the most reliable way of doing this, and it depends on what was selected before. So I just did right, and then shift control left. Right. So this time right just selected that note. Right. It's like going back and forth. Sometimes when I hit right, it selects the last note, and I think it has to do with, well, which direction I did the selection. It always knows the last note that you actually selected. So this is an interesting little conundrum I'm discovering here of how to do this reliably. But maybe if I go, I'm trying to avoid clicking, but whatever. I always want a measure plus a note, and then apply. Measure plus a note. And so forth. So it's a little bit painstaking, right? But, I'm not going to do the whole piece, but I wanted to get in a little bit of rhythm of it so you can see that once you get the hang of it, you can do it relatively quickly. This is how you do pedaling. So Well, that's a good question. Will R work? No, R copies the entire selection. I don't think you can select this and press R. That would be kind of neat if you could, though. That would be really cool if you could. What you might be able to do is use Control Shift Drag, but I don't think. Wait a minute. Is it Control Shift Drag? Yeah, I think it is. Let me try this again. Control Shift Drag is usually how you add things to the palette, but what it really is it's cloning the element. So if I select this and use Control Shift Drag, am I getting that wrong? Is it Control Alt Drag? Now I'm doubting myself. Boy, you think I do this? You think I've done this before? But I think it just doesn't work here. Yeah, Control Shift Drag. Control Shift Drag not on a handle. Yeah, so it didn't get the length. It didn't copy the length. So no, R copies selections like actual range selections, like sets of notes, but it doesn't copy individual symbols like that. So okay, so let me play this now so you can hear what it sounds like. That's more like it. What I'm doing with my hand is showing you what the foot does. You kind of wait until you play the first chord and then your foot comes up so that you get just that tiny little bleed for the first couple of milliseconds of the chord, and then the pedal comes up, cleans off the last chord, and sustains the rest of the measure. So once you've added all those, now you can right-click one, say select all similar elements, and V to make them invisible. And so now you can have them invisible so that they don't kind of clutter up your score, because a pianist would know to change pedal every chord. And it's not always going to be like this one right here. There's two chords in this measure. So this measure, I wouldn't actually do it this way. Like I don't want that B blurring into that B flat. So for this measure, I would actually fine tune it a little more. And same with this measure. Any measure where there's more than one chord, I have to delete it. If it continues off a system boundary, shift plus left or shift plus right don't work correctly. So anytime the chord changes within the measure, you're going to need to pedal change within the measure also. So that's a thing. So as far as the playback goes, that's something to be aware of pedal-wise. All right, so let me talk about some other aspects of this. And now that I've entered those, they're not invisible anymore. I will reselect. Oh, by the way, if I select all and select all similar elements and think V to make invisible, it's not going to work because some of them are already invisible. V toggles visibility. So the things that were invisible now become visible and vice versa. What I want to do is make them all invisible. So what I'm going to do is come over to the inspector and just uncheck where it says visible. And now they're all invisible regardless of what they were before. Okay, so that's something. What else is there? Well, here's what else. One thing is all these arpeggio symbols that you have notated with the arrow up, that's, I would say, superfluous. It's understood that arpeggios are up. The only time you would need to notate that explicitly is if you've got a mixture of up and down, and now you need to clarify which ones are up and which ones are down. But by default, they're all up. We don't need the arrows up. So I don't know if there's a way to change them all. It doesn't look like in the inspector I can change the style of the inspector, so of that arrow, so of that arpeggio. So the only way to actually fix that would be to remove them all and re-add them. I can't think of any way to just replace them. Like I would love to think if I click this and then just, how that did work. Wow, I wonder if that'll work for all of them. Let's see, I'm going to select, I'll right click an arpeggio, select all similar, and now I'm just going to click the arpeggio symbol. Oh, Wow, I had no idea that that would actually work, but it did. Yeah, I just wanted to drag one to make sure there weren't two. All right, yay, MuseScore. I didn't write that code. I would have remembered doing that. So yeah, I would just use these. And so for one thing, it's just a little distracting to see all those arrows, but it also makes the measures take a little more space because it's allocating space for those up arrows that doesn't need to be there. So uh, okay, yeah. So Peter, yeah, we will, now that we've figured out how to get you on board, I think we will have you come on after I go do some more stuff here and talk about some more things, and then we'll have you talk. So so that's something that I noticed right away. There's not a lot of issues here, really. I mean, I think you did a really good job, but there's a few things that make me go, a little bit. And this measure here, so there is nothing wrong with that measure. But here's what I can say about it. It looks a little confused. When I first saw this, I thought that it was two voices and they were upside down. In other words, that the C's were part of one voice, and this chord here was part of another voice, and those chords were meant to be simultaneously, and MuseScore was offsetting it. And now I see that this is beat 2. I feel like this measure is too crowded for me to understand that. And that happens sometimes if we have a cluster like this, that G is kind of sticking into the space here. So I think, subjectively speaking, it's going to be clearer to me if I add some leading space in front of that triplet. So I'm going to add about a space, one staff space worth of leading space to separate that out a little bit visually. So I selected that C, used segment leading space to add a little more space. And pretty much there are several other places where that same basic thing happens. We have a cluster on beat 1, quarter note triplet on beat 2. I remembered seeing it like, okay, so this measure, it's not as problematic because this measure is not as crowded. It's the places where it happened, but the measure was crowded. So this one, I don't necessarily feel the need for it. So you'll have to make some judgment calls as to that. So that was something I noticed. There was something I heard in the playback that I'm wondering about. This measure here. So this, I think when we had the pedal just going all the way through, it wasn't sustaining that C. What about if I delete the pedal? Yeah, when I heard it before, that C wasn't sustaining, and I'm not sure why, to be honest, because I thought maybe you had fiddled with it somehow, but now it's sustaining fine, so maybe it was still an artifact of that pedal resustaining, but I thought maybe you had done something to make that C chop off, but probably not anything else. It was probably still just another side effect of that pedal issue. All right, so yeah, I think you've done a really good job everywhere here, and I'm just sort of looking for things that really jump out. Now, you had pointed out about some of these quadruplets that you think that Vince really played these, because usually people don't notate it that way. This is one for all the children call their favorite time of year. Usually people notate that as favorite time of year, eighth, quarter, quarter, quarter. But I haven't listened to the recording enough to say that it wasn't quadruplets. If you say they are, I believe you. Or maybe you're talking about these. There were other quadruplets elsewhere. Maybe you were talking about those. So in any case, things are basically all looking good here. But then there's the next thing I see that's maybe a little bit off to me is these measures here in the bridge. Okay, this chord is a G flat 13, G flat 7 with added extensions on top of that. This E here is not an E. Right? Technically, G flat 7 is G flat, B flat, D flat, F flat. You might think no one wants to read F flat. I beg to differ. I look at this and say, hey, that looks like a sixth. and my hand stretches out only as big as a sixth, and I probably play an E flat there instead of an E. That's likely what happens. After all, the same thing happened here. My first thought in looking at this is, oh, you messed this one up. This is D flat 7, and that B should really be C flat. But no, it really is B flat. It's the sixth of the chord. But now I've got sixths on the brain, and I see this, and I think it's another sixth. This is a situation where accurate notation, F flat, actually helps with readability, because then I can understand it as a seventh. It fits, because otherwise it looks like a sixth, and I think that this is the sixth and not the seventh, and it causes me to have that little mental disconnect there, and it's going to lead to sight reading errors. So J, to respell that as F flat, I think will be an improvement. And that happens consistently throughout the bridge, because there's other G flat 7 chords that happens on. And there's also D flat 7 chords, like here. So here, that B is really a C flat. So I'm going to fix that there too. So yeah, good. That anywhere that happens, I'm not saying every single time you always need to spell things correctly, but I do think people they misjudge how important correct spelling can actually be to a pianist. It's less important to someone reading a single line. If you're reading a trumpet part, then we just want it to read smoothly. We don't look at a note and know or care what it is vertically relative to something else. But I can look at this shape here and say, hey, that's a seventh. And my hand reaches for a seventh. That doesn't exist other than on the piano. And also, if I see the chord symbol and know that note, I want to understand the relationship of that note to the chord symbols, that's a useful thing also. So in any case, this thing that I'm telling you is something pianists are more likely to key in on. They might not be aware. They might think they don't like C flat, but then you give them a B and see how often they mess it up. Or you give them an E here, see how often they mess that up. Okay. That happens throughout. Then there's this little passage here. So beautiful little passage. We learned all about that motion of 9 to flat 9 and 4 to 3 in the jazz piano holiday course. What I'll say about this is this notation here is, you can do it, but I don't recommend it. So when I say it, I mean you have a chord here with two of the notes tied. The C is tied, the B flat is tied, but then you're showing the F moving to the E. This is not disallowed in rules of notation. MuseScore will allow you to do it. But in general, this is a situation multiple voices are invented for. Now, I will say using multiple voices when the moving voice is in the middle of a chord isn't pretty, but let's do it anyhow. So I'm gonna send that to voice 2 with Control Alt 2, and send the E to voice 2, also Control Alt 2. So, and now these guys don't need to be tied anymore. They can just be a dotted half note. This isn't a pretty arrangement here, the F kind of tucked in the other notes, but this is correct. This is how it's done. And yeah, this is better. There are situations where you can get some ugly situations going on if you have interlocking voices, but this one isn't bad. It's not bad enough to want to make me resort to that tie thing. I will resort to the tie thing if it creates a real cluster of things that is hard to read. But this is not hard to read. That's a preferable notation. All right, let's take a look now at this grace note situation here. So you have two different grace note durations notated here. You have an eighth note and a 16th. I can't see any reason for that. I would notate them the same way. And I guess I don't think of there being a particular rule for what these what the what the duration should be for grace notes. But typically what I think of is if there's only one of them, I'll notate as an eighth. If there's more than one, I'm more likely to notate them as sixteenths, unless maybe it's approaching a whole note, in which case more than 1/8 seems fine, but it's quite subjective. I don't think of there being as rules for this. But in any case, I'm going to select this note and just press 3 to change it to a 16th. So I feel like that's better, or I could change them both to eighths. But it was kind of distracting to me to see two different durations there. It didn't seem like it served a musical purpose, and it kind of confused me. All right. Next page, there's a lot of the same things going on, so we're going to see a lot of the same stuff happening here. And so comments that I would have would be the same kinds of comments. But actually, this page, the way it lays out, there's nothing in particular going on. Now, I will call attention to this. All right. I'm thinking here. All right. I'm not sure what I'm thinking. Okay, one thing that I'm thinking here is that this half note has no reason to be a half note. It could be a dotted half because it is the whole measure. That much is true. But, okay, so here's what I'm thinking about. This quadruplet here, it's a quadruplet. And yes, in the bottom staff, if you want it to line up with that, this is correct. Dotted half, quarter. This is confusing. It's I don't have a better answer for you, but it is a little confusing, this four tuplet in which there's only two notes. But the fact that it lines up with the top voice, I'm giving it a pass. I'm not going to complain. By the way, when I added the dot, MuseScore added that rest in the next measure. It tends to do that, so I need to manually delete it. So I'm willing to live with that. But then here's the next thing. The rhythm in the next measure is essentially the same thing, right? Two dotted quarters in 3/4 is basically a duplet. It's a two half notes in this, or two half notes. It's whatever, two dotted quarters. It's, I don't even know how to describe what it is, but it's this quadruplet in which the first two notes are actually a half note, and this makes it look like it's two different rhythms. So if you're going to use quadruplets here, which by the way, you don't have to, you could have notated these quadruplets as dotted eighths. They're all dotted eighths, dotted eighth, 16th tied to eight. You could have notated it that way and it would have been accurate. It would have been harder to read. I don't recommend it. But so this rhythm here, two dotted quarters in 3/4, it's okay. In a jazz setting, it doesn't expose beat 3, right? So we often like to expose beat 3. In a jazz setting, we don't mind so much. But I will say, coming off of the quadruplet, it makes these rhythms feel too disconnected. So I think what I want to do is I'm going to change this to a whole note. No, not a whole note, a half note. And I'm just going to remember what it is that's tied to. It's it's D E A, right? Change this to a half note, a dotted half note, and then what I'm going to do is hit Control 2 to split it up into a duplet. But when I do that, it wants to spell it with two quarter notes. There's two different ways of handling duplets in 3/4. I personally, because you just had the quadruplet, I'd much rather see this as notated as half notes. So I'm going to not use Control 2. I'm going to use add tuplets other. And now I have to do math. I want to show, oh gosh, is there any way to do this and make it work out right? What I want to do is show two half notes in the space of 1.5, right? I want to show two in the space of 1.5, but that's not a thing. So I'm going to have to say 4/3, and MuseScore is going to notate it as a quadruplet. And maybe I have to live with that. Half note, and then half note, D, E, A. Now, if it bothers me that this shows as a 4, I could hide that 4 and put just a number 2 on top of it, but maybe I'm going to be okay with it. It does help emphasize the similarity between that rhythm. And then I would do the same in the left hand, C and B flat. So dotted here, and then I'll just say control 4, since now that I know that's going to do the trick. If someone else can think, whoops, not that, I mean half note, and then half note C and B flat. Maybe someone else knows of a better way to force this to show as a 2 instead of as a 4. I know it's come up a couple times on the forum, and either people had a good workaround or they didn't. So I don't necessarily have an answer for you, but I feel like that since you just came off of a quadruplet, I think I'd like to see more quadruplet there. Um, I remember there being one other thing that I wanted to comment on as we were playing through it. Okay, so here's a place also, and this probably happened other times and I didn't notice it. Or maybe not. Okay, so these places here, the A flat minor 7, you're notating as C flat, which is good. Now you're calling this A flat minor 7, no 5. I don't need to see that. We omit fifths all the time, and for that matter, the fifth is right there in the melody. So you don't need to tell me about no 5s. I wasn't even paying attention to the chord symbols, but none of those need to say no 5. We don't need to be that explicit about them. Now, if you're putting it there because you're reminding yourself things about the voicing, that's fine. But from a notation perspective, we don't want that. Also, from a notation of chord symbols, you're mostly using MI, which is what I recommend, but you just have an M here. So the thing that happened here was in that one spot that I was just looking at, you now have a B instead of a C flat. And again, it makes this look like a third instead of a second. That's not improving readability. C flat is actually better. And you got that, the way I would want it other places. So that's fine. So what was the other thing? This G flat chord is off. So this G flat chord should be lined up with beat 1, and somehow it isn't. And why is that? Oh, you know why it is? Because it is lined up. The G flat is lined up with the stems, but because of the cluster of notes and then the accidentals, the whole chord has been moved over. I feel like, subjectively speaking, this chord wants to move over a little bit so that it looks like it's at the beginning of the measure, because that made it look too much like that chord came in late. So I feel like, okay, MuseScore probably could have done a better job of that. And really, for that matter, this chord too, now that I look at it, now it makes me want to look to see if that happens anywhere else on that G flat chord. It kind of happens everywhere because there's a cluster and there's an accidental. I might want to actually adjust those G flat chords across the board, maybe. I don't know. I'll have to think about it. But anyhow, that's a thing to consider. But there was another thing rhythmically somewhere. Here's that same grace note thing. Change it to a 16th note. Here's that same thing with the multiple voices. And yeah, it's a lot of the same things, just slightly different notes. And maybe that's all there was. Yeah, here's another place where just the crowding of this measure is causing it to look a little wonky. But here's the other thing. I feel like, yes, logically speaking, the melody here is voice 1. These things are voice 2 because it's not the melody. But I feel like you're better off reversing these, simply because I want the voice 1 above, and it'll unclutter what's happening here. So right now, because you've got these stems down, because voice 2 defaults that way. In fact, I'm just going to let them be voice 1 and voice 2. I'm just going to flip the stems, but it's not going to fix the rest. I want to fix the rest too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Tools, Voices, Exchange 1 and 2. And notice what it did. It got the stems out of the way of the dot, and it got the rest up where the notes were. So just by allowing this melody note to have moved into voice 2, because it's no longer the highest thing, yes, voice one as the melody makes sense, but if voice two is going to come in above voice one, let it be voice two. If your counter melody is going to be in voice, if your counter melody is going to be above your melody, let it be voice one, so that the stems and the rest do the right thing by default. You can fix them later, but why? And so there's probably other places where you did those little fills, although I think most of your other fills didn't need multiple voices. Most of your other fills, you just stole time from the note, right? Like here, you didn't hold the G and then bring in the C in another voice. You just cut off the G a little bit, and that's what you did most of the other places where there's any sort of fill, like here, da da dum. Da, 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 and then you didn't use a second voice for this, so that's a wise decision. There's no reason to, especially if the pedal's going to hold the note for you. If you can avoid the complication of multiple voices and still get the point across, by all means, more power to you. So I feel like that cleaned this up. And then now that I reverse them, and notice MuseScore is perfectly happy to have this tie be cross voice, but realistically, since voice one, since the melody was then done here, I can move this to voice two also, and I'm using my keyboard shortcut so that this is in voice two, voice one also. Now I can just delete these rests because I don't actually need voice one. I mean, I don't need voice two in this measure. So those are the things that I saw in here. And yeah, it's not a lot of stuff, and it's more of the same. Here's another one of those D flats. Here's another one of those, C flats. Here's another one of those F flats. Oh, wait a minute. Is this for real? Ah, God, I saw this one. Don't do this. Don't put an octave above on bass clef. It's not something we do. So instead, I'm going to remove that marking. I'm going to move it up an octave, and I'm just going to put that in treble clef. Let that one measure be treble clef, and then go back to bass clef. And in this case, since the whole measure, this is the way to do it. Select the whole measure, the clef change shows up before the measure. If you need to do it for a single note within the measure, then you select just that note, and MuseScore will happily put in a mid-measure clef change. But if it happens at the beginning of the measure like this does, you select the whole measure, and MuseScore knows the clef change goes before the bar line. So this is how to notate that thing that you just did. It's more familiar to pianists to read this way. We don't use octave above in bass clef, and we don't use octave below in treble clef. Oh, that reminds me how there's always little things. One other thing I noticed right off the bat are these places where you have the quadruplets. It is normally correct to put quadruplets or any sort of tuplet markings on the stem side. And this was a long debate on Facebook and on the forums recently, where some college students who didn't know what they were doing with notation notated it incorrectly in a famous series of fake books, and it sort of caught on. And some people now always think, oh, you're supposed to put tuplets on the note head side, but that's not correct. Tuplets belong on the stem side because that's where beams go also. That's the side where you look at for rhythm. That if the beams are going to go there for ordinary eighth note triplets, we want the tuplet marking right next to the beam. That's the normal place where they go. So anytime the stems are going in the same direction, that's the case. Now there's places where the stems are in opposite directions, then you just got to pick. So this is the correct location for that tuplet. But given what's going on musically here, it is crowded, right? I've got this down stem note here, which, by the way, should also be a dotted note. No reason for it not to be. Oh, I see why it wasn't, because you're going to bring that B flat again in here. Okay. You know what? Okay, so here's the other thing. As long as I'm talking about that. So if this had been just the half note like you had it, notice what's going on. Technically speaking, that half note is done a little bit before that B flat happens, and that's not really what happens. That B flat stays, and then it just gets repeated. So why not notate it? So notating it this way is a little bit of a lie. It makes it, if you wanted to play this accurately, you would actually have to pick up the B flat a little bit somewhere between these two notes. That's not what you really meant. You just meant hold it until the B flat. On the other hand, why not let the pedal do that for you? I would simplify this. Let's get rid of all that and just do that. Yeah, now this B flat isn't being held, but we know the pedal's going to do that for us anyhow. I kind of feel like this is what I would rather deal with here. That's a subjective decision you can think about, but it's not going to sound different either way because of the pedal. But it's still a bit crowded, so I'm going to flip that tuplet to the bottom. And I think a lot of the places where you have these tuplets, they're better off flipped underneath. So that was something I noticed from the beginning. All right, so yeah, I think this now catches most of the things that I noticed right off the bat when I first looked at it, as well as the things that I'm looking at it that I'm seeing now. I think it's an excellent job overall, and the things that I got to point out were really interesting things that are like, things that we don't talk about every day, but are nice. And now I want to start flipping tuplet brackets, but like those ones that I just converted into quadruplets. Yeah, that helps me there too. So anyhow, what I want to do now is see if I can bring Peter back on. So I do have Peter 3 minutes behind. Oh, that should only be seconds. All right, so I am going to bring, if I can, if this doesn't screw us up, I'm going to bring Peter on, and we'll see if this works. And if it works, great. And if not, we'll just chat. But in principle, Peter, if you now come back to that link and join me in the green room, I will be able to add you once you rejoin me here. Meanwhile, if people want to be, asking other questions and things based on the score here, feel free.
Mark, can you hear me?
Am I hearing you, Peter? I can hear you.
Yeah.
So I can hear Peter. I think I now am going to add Peter, except for some reason, I still don't have the option to add you that I expect to have. So something is still funny about this whole business here. Yeah, there's this whole thing that's supposed to happen where I have the ability to add guests, but for some
it feels
reason,
like I should be there.
Yeah, it
Since my
feels that way
voice
to
is
me too.
there.
So the question is, those of you who are here listening, can you hear Peter talking to me? Peter, say something.
I'm going to thank Mark, first of all, for taking a look at this piece. And it was actually very valuable to see these little edits that are exactly the kind of things that I was looking for. But without my picture, that's fine. But I do have some questions if
Okay.
people are able to hear me.
All right. So I'm going to cut you off there and ask, so could people just hear Peter talking, or was that just a bunch of silence just then? So yeah, for some reason, you're just not in here. So I'm going to let you talk to me, and then I'm just going to, oh, I can.
But I do have some questions. Okay.
Oh yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Okay, so we don't see you, but we don't need to see you, right? So
Correct.
we're just going to go with this. We're just going to go with it the way it's. Ask away.
Okay. You covered actually a number of the questions that I had.
Nice.
Kind of starting from the end, though, since you were talking about the multiple voices and particularly that last measure.
Yeah.
The question for me is, I feel uncomfortable even having two voices there because I look at that and I think, well, I can't hold that chord and play that fill. So I always wanted to do it by just stealing time. And what is the right way to decide on that?
That's a really good observation. And again, I'm okay. Good. I just wanted to check again on the sound since I changed something. Okay, so that's because I had made that same observation about here in measure whatever it is 13, where I got rid of your half note B flat and said, the pedal's going to take care of it for you anyhow. That simplified the notation to me. I thought it was worth it. Here, though, I think if you had tried to notate this just as a quarter note, I'd be disappointed. I don't like it. Because we know it's a long note. This is the melody note, and we know it should sustain. So even though the pedal would have done it for me, I'm much happier with this. In fact, I'm so much happier with it that I actually want to double the length of that thing. So I just press W to actually even sustain it across the bar line like that. Even though I'm not physically going to hold that chord, I'm going to let the pedal do it for me. I'd rather see it that way.
Okay. Um, my next comment, just briefly on the piece itself, is understanding that this was kind of a compilation. Garaldi has two different versions of this in his recordings. He has a vocal version and an
Right.
instrumental version.
Right.
So it is in his instrumental version where in such
Mm.
as measure 13, where he uses the quadruplet,
Ah.
but
And
on the
that's why
vocal, it's
most
always
transcriptions
written
have the
differently.
other rhythm, because the vocal
Right,
version is different.
right.
Ah, good to know.
But I wanted to capture that. I couldn't play it by myself if I was using a backing track
Mm.
because the alignment didn't work. But going back to the beginning, actually, I'm noticing now that as you look at it on MuseScore, when I set this up and in my MuseScore, I uh, vertically aligned those arpeggios, uh, and it's not showing up on MuseScore.
Oh, well, you know what? I think that got lost with the very first thing I did. Remember, I replaced all those up arrow ones? I think,
Oh,
I think, so you vertically align them like that, right?
well, I did, but I had to do it manually because I
Yeah,
couldn't
well, that's what I
remember
just did
how
too.
to.
I dragged
Oh,
it.
okay, okay.
I just dragged it too. But let me see if I select both these, and then I come over to the palette to change them. Um, yeah, changing them got rid of that. So it got rid of that alignment. So that's a good question, is how important is it to align them? And so the other thing is, realistically, that's not how it would be done. Um, have showing two separate, and I should have caught this also, showing two separate arpeggios isn't the way we do it. Now, this is how we're going to get MuseScore to play it back. And this is wrong because it's not going to arpeggiate us one smooth arpeggio. It's not going to go across the hands. It's going to go blum, 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 blum with one note of each hand together. It's going to start both arpeggios together. That's just a limitation of MuseScore's playback. But here's how it should look. I'm going to hide the bottom one, and then I'm going to take the top one and use Shift down arrow to extend it. Oh, no, not shift down. Oh, let me reset that. Select the bottom handle, shift down arrow. So this is how it's really done. One big arpeggio. Unfortunately, when you do that, it looks like it doesn't know how to avoid the second there. I want to see if it's going to fix itself. No, it doesn't. So you're still going to have to adjust things manually. But if I come to the inspector, there. That's how it should look. Ooh, I just did it crooked. Look at that. I moved one, but not the other side. It's like weirdly crooked now. Huh.
Is the second one still there? The lower one?
It is. It's just visible.
Oh, I see.
So, is this really crooked, or are my eyes playing tricks on me? My eyes are playing tricks on me. Okay. It just looked crooked. So anyhow, this is what it should look like. And so now if I turn off invisible items, I have a shortcut for it. Yeah, it's just weird how crooked that actually looks to me. This is what a two-handed arpeggio should look like, one single arpeggio. So the trick was to select the bottom handle of the top arpeggio and use shift down. But when it does that, it loses all logical sense of how to avoid things. So it's I guess an unfortunate limitation of that. Hopefully, a future version of MuseScore will support two-handed arpeggios better. But this is what we are wanting to achieve.
Okay. My question with the arpeggio extends to what you started with the arrows on the arpeggios. And when I
Yeah.
started notating this piece, I thought there were places as I was listening to Guaraldi's instrumental where he rolled the chords down for certain fills,
Mm-hmm.
so arpeggiated them down. I was wrong as I listened more
Ah,
closely. So I understand I wouldn't have needed that. But if you had a place like where he had a fill where he rolled down, would you then notate those with a down
I would.
arpeggio?
I
Okay.
would. And then the question is, would that therefore compel you to notate the other ones with an up? And I don't know. If it's only a few downs, I would let those just be a few downs and let the rest just be plain. But if it's constantly going back and forth between the ups and the downs, I think I would be explicit about them all.
Okay. Um, and in that vein, throughout the piece, and I don't know if this was a Guaraldiism, but he rolled these chords so heavily throughout the entire piece. And I didn't want to just keep writing these arpeggios down all the time. It seemed like it was just too cumbersome. Is that kind of something that you just accept? And
Yeah, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to notate the first one, and I am then going to move it off as far as I need to move it, and then I'm going to write uh, simile.
so that is proper notation, or that's how it
Yeah,
would be
yeah.
notated?
And the
Oh,
thing
really?
is, then you use your judgment into how many of those get arpeggiated. If you really need to be explicit about which ones are arpeggiated, if you think the guy pianist isn't going to figure it out, then I guess you got to be explicit. But this kind of thing, simile, or sometimes we write continue simile, cont sim, is a common thing. I see James also has asked about, instead of moving the tuplets, like when I flip the tuplet below here, he's asking, could I have just increased the space between the staves? Yeah, I could have. Um, Either one could be okay. And I, when in doubt, I get out my trusty copy of Elaine Gould's Behind Bars, and I would look it up in there and see what she says, and I would look it up in some published sheet music. But I'm just responding to what I saw. It looked crowded, and I kind of feel like seeing the tuplets outside the staff is probably what I would more commonly see. But I'd have to consult with someone else. I don't claim to have the answer there.
I just have two quick
Yeah.
questions. One is this really is in part due to the jazz font that comes with this, but the major and minor chord symbols,
Mm-hmm.
they look awfully similar. Is it proper to have them both small
Yes.
caps like that?
Yeah, well, proper, the thing is, there's a lot of different styles. This is the exact look. Here, let me show you where this is copied from. So it's a friend of mine from college, Ann Kranitsky, who was the person who did the handwriting for the new real book, which was a series of fake books from Chuck Scher Publishing, and Chuck Scher was a bassist who lived in the area where I was going to school and where Anne was going to school, and uh, so Anne was hired to actually do the calligraphy, and so her handwriting became the basis for that font, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. And it's not like she invented this style. It's a style that comes from these guys named Brandt and Romer. Um, but yeah, you'll see that small caps look is pretty much how things are done. Right, there's MA and there's MI.
Okay. My last quick question then is the original one I had about double bar lines throughout
Oh,
this piece. He had this odd six measure kind of intro in the
mm-hmm.
instrumental, and I assume maybe there's a double bar line. I don't know the rules for double bar lines, when
Yeah.
you use them, when you don't.
Okay. In classical music, they tend to be stingier with double bars than we typically are in jazz. I put them every end of significant phrase. So this song is basically you got a 6 bar intro. So I will then add a double bar. And then the melody is every 8 bars after that.
Oh, wow.
basically is where double bars would go. In a jazz chart, that is what I expect. Again, classical charts tend to be more stingy with them, but in jazz, we very typically use 8 bar. And then we'll put rehearsal letters there too, if it's something, maybe not solo piano pieces. We don't tend to use them there, but any ensemble music will have rehearsal letters and double bars. Yeah, every 8 bars or whatever, the 12 bars if it's a blues, whatever the phrase length is.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I don't think I have really any other significant questions. Appreciate the
All
time on
right,
this.
great. Well, thank you, Peter. And I had a lot of fun doing this, and yeah, I'm looking forward to doing more sessions like this. And we're going to be able to do more of the master classes. So tomorrow I'll talk more about what the master class is going to look like going forward, because we're going to do more of these, having guests come on, so we can really get into people's pieces in more detail. But for now, I want to thank everyone for being here for the MuseScore Café. Thank you, Peter, so much for volunteering to let me use your piece as a guinea pig here, and then letting me take a look at it. And you did a great job, and it was really fun providing that input. So I'm here every Wednesday. Just come back for more insight into using MuseScore. I neglected to post my usual commercial to the top of the chat, so let me just make sure it's there. Yes, the chord symbols with the small caps. Whoa, that just stopped my playback. Okay, whatever. The small caps, that's part of the Muse Jazz font. So if you use the Jazz templates, you get that font, Muse Jazz Text. But it's not just that font, it's the use of the Jazz and then select Jazz as your style, then you get that style there. So there you go. So anyhow, back to my commercial. Basically, I do courses, right? You know that. Most of you know that. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But if you go to masteringmuseschool.masteringmusescore.com, you will find all my courses, including my MuseScore course, my music theory courses, and so forth. And sign up and learn everything you ever wanted to know. Enjoyed the session, and